What if the ground you walk on every day isn't truly solid? What if beneath the thin crust of asphalt and concrete, beneath the foundation of your home, something ancient, breathing, and alive is hiding? A power capable of turning the world you know into ruins in a single instant. We trust the earth. We build our cities on it, raise our children, love, and dream. But we forget that we are merely guests on the surface of a giant that sometimes stirs in its sleep. This story is not about monsters from the deep. It's about the monster that lies directly beneath our feet. A story of a city that, in one night, came to know the full fury of the planet. Of people who thought they knew everything about the sea until the sea came for them. This is a tale of how civilization can be wiped from the face of the earth in minutes, and what remains after when the rumbling stops and the water recedes. Are you ready to hear the pulse of catastrophe? Then listen. The night is just beginning. Midnight. The small coastal town of Kamioka in the Miyagi Prefecture of Japan was sound asleep. The air was filled with the salty scent of the sea and the fragrance of late-blooming sakura blossoms still clinging to the branches. Fishing boats, bobbing gently in the harbor, cast long shadows in the light of lonely lamps. The lights in the houses had long been extinguished. Only the occasional bark of a stray dog or the hum of a scooter along the deserted embankment broke the silence. The town breathed tranquility. It seemed this night would be no different from hundreds of others. But deep below, tens of kilometers down, the tectonic plates that had slumbered for decades began to move. A century's worth of accumulated stress was seeking a way out. The animals felt it first. Dogs in their homes began to whine and pace, scratching at doors. Cats, with arched backs and fur on end, hid under beds. In the harbor, seagulls suddenly burst into the air with alarmed cries and flew inland. But the people slept. They did not hear nature's silent scream. And then the sound came. At first, it wasn't a sound, but a feeling. A low-frequency vibration that traveled through the ground, through the walls of houses, and chilled you to the bone. It was as if a giant, endless freight train was approaching from somewhere far beyond the horizon. The rumble grew, becoming denser, more palpable. Windows began to rattle, and dishes clinked in cupboards. Sleepy people began to wake, sitting up in their beds in confusion. "What is that? A thunderstorm?" they asked each other. But the sky was clear and studded with stars. And then, the jolt. Not just a jolt, but a monstrous, violent blow from below. The earth convulsed as if the planet itself had momentarily stopped spinning and was shaken by an unseen giant. This was not an earthquake in the usual sense. The ground didn't just shake. It moved in waves like the surface of the ocean in a storm. The walls of houses began to crack, plaster raining down. Books and photographs flew from shelves. Heavy wardrobes crashed to the floor with a deafening roar. Roofs caved in, tiles showering down like rain. The asphalt on the streets split with a dry crack, forming deep fissures from which clouds of dust erupted. Utility poles swayed like pendulums, wires snapping with showers of sparks and falling to the ground. The town plunged into a darkness broken only by the flashes of short circuits. Screams of terror filled the night air. People, driven mad with fear, ran out into the streets in whatever they were wearing, pajamas, barefoot, clutching their crying children. But there was no escape there either. There was nowhere to run. The very ground was giving way beneath their feet. It felt as if hell itself had opened up below them. The world they knew was vanishing into chaos and darkness. 15 seconds, just a quarter of a minute. The time it takes to drink a glass of water or wait for a traffic light to turn green. But for the residents of Kamioka, these 15 seconds became an eternity that turned their world upside down. That's how long the first, most powerful tremor lasted. But its force was so immense that it reshaped the very landscape of the town. Entire blocks, especially those built decades ago from wood and clay, folded like houses of cards. The sound of collapsing buildings merged into a single, deafening roar. The crack of splintering wood, the screech of twisting metal, the crash of falling concrete. the air filled with a thick, choking dust that clogged the lungs and blinded the eyes. The bridge connecting the town's two districts was its pride, an elegant steel structure, a symbol of unity. It had withstood countless typhoons, but it was not designed for its foundations to begin dancing. With a monstrous shriek of metal, the central span of the bridge buckled, broke, and collapsed into the dark waters of the river, severing the town in two forever. The few cars on the bridge at that moment vanished with it. The corner store on the main street, where people had been laughing and buying groceries just hours before, was reduced to a shapeless pile of concrete and rebar. The owner's family, who lived on the second floor, was buried alive. In the chaos, no one heard their screams. The school, built on a small hill, survived. It had been constructed according to new, stricter seismic codes. But even its walls were covered in deep cracks. A statue of its founder in the courtyard toppled from its pedestal and shattered. And the most terrifying part was that this was only the first blow. The earth continued to tremble. Weaker, yet still powerful aftershocks followed one after another, allowing not a single moment of respite. Each new tremor brought a fresh wave of panic and screams. People lay on the ground, clinging to it with their fingers, praying to every god they knew for this nightmare to end. They didn't know that the real nightmare had not even begun. They looked at the ruins of their homes, at the fractured earth, and thought the worst was over. They were not looking toward the sea, but they should have been, because out there, in the dark depths, a new, even more terrifying threat was being born. The earthquake was merely the prelude. The main act of this tragedy was yet to come. When a main tremor ceased and the earth was left with only a faint shudder, an eerie silence fell, broken only by the groans of the injured and the cries of children. Stunned and disoriented, people began to pick themselves up off the ground. In the darkness, through clouds of dust, they tried to comprehend the scale of the destruction. And in that awful silence, they heard a new sound. It came from the sea, a low, deep roar, unlike anything else. It was as if an ancient leviathan, sleeping on the ocean floor, had awakened. The sound vibrated not just through the ground, but through the air itself. An old fisherman named Kenji, who had spent his entire life at sea, was the first to understand what it meant. His face turned pale. "Tsunami!" he screamed, his voice breaking. "To the hills. Everyone to the hills now." But not everyone heard him, and many didn't believe him. A tsunami? The sea looked calm. But then, something strange, something unnatural began to happen. The water in the harbor began to recede rapidly. It pulled away from the shore with incredible speed, exposing the seabed. Boats and ships settled onto the muddy ground with a dull thud. Hundreds of meters of coastline turned into a wet expanse of shells and seaweed. Some children, not understanding the horror of the situation, pointed with curiosity. "Look, the sea is gone. Fish." They saw fish flopping on the seabed, starfish, and crabs. A few people even walked down to witness the bizarre spectacle up close. Kenji and other elders who knew the tales of the great wave shouted desperately, trying to make people run. "It's a trap. The sea will come back. It will take everything." And it did come back. A dark line appeared on the horizon. At first, it was barely visible, but it grew with every second, transforming into a colossal wall of water. This was not a normal wave with a white crest. This was a black, smooth mass of the ocean, heaved upward by the tectonic shift. A wall several meters high, racing toward the shore with the roar and speed of a freight train. The harbor took the first hit. The wave effortlessly tore the fishing boats from the mud and hurled them deep into the city like children's toys. Heavy concrete piers fractured and disappeared into the churning water. Then the wave crashed over the embankment and flooded the streets. It wasn't just a flow of water. It was a crushing mixture of water, sand, silt, and the debris of boats, cars, and shattered homes. This chaotic torrent possessed a monstrous, destructive force. It obliterated everything in its path. Cars tumbled through the water like tin cans. One-story houses that had survived the earthquake were swept from their foundations and carried away. Those who hadn't managed to escape to higher ground were consumed by the wave in an instant. Their screams were drowned out by the roar of the elements. The current was so powerful that resistance was futile. Those who tried to cling to poles or trees were ripped away and swept into the swirling chaos. The city that had just been shattered by the earth was now being drowned by the sea. Salvation was where the ground was higher. The school, built on a hill, became an island of hope in this raging ocean of chaos. A few dozen people, those who had heard the old fisherman's warning or had instinctively known to run uphill, managed to reach it just minutes before the wave arrived. They scrambled up the stairs to the roof of the three-story building and watched in horror as the dark water consumed everything around them. They were saved, but they were trapped. Below, as far as the eye could see, stretched a black, churning expanse of water, from which only the roofs of the tallest buildings and the tops of trees emerged. The water carried with it wreckage, debris, and, most horrifyingly, bodies. The night became their prison. A piercing wind whipped at their faces, and the cold chilled them to the bone. Their wet clothes offered no warmth. It was almost pitch black, the darkness broken only by distant flashes of lightning. But the most terrifying thing was not the darkness, but the sounds. Desperate cries for help drifted up from the water. The cries of those clinging to floating debris, fighting for their lives in the freezing water. At first, there were many cries, but with each passing hour, they grew fainter until finally, a sinister silence fell, broken only by the lapping of water and the howl of the wind. Every survivor on that roof understood. They could do nothing. Any attempt to help would be suicide. This feeling of powerlessness was more crushing than the cold. Someone found a small keychain flashlight in a soaked jacket pocket. Miraculously, it still worked. When it was switched on, its dim beam of light seemed blindingly bright in the oppressive darkness. That small light became the center of their tiny world. It was the only light for all of them, a symbol that they were still alive, that they were not alone. People huddled together, tried to share warmth. A young mother cradled her baby, wrapping him in every dry piece of cloth she could find. An old teacher quietly recited prayers. Two men, strangers before this night, silently supported an injured man with a broken leg. They sat almost without speaking, talking only in whispers. Everyone was afraid of provoking the elements further. They feared the earth would begin to shake again, and their last refuge would collapse into the water. They feared the water would rise even higher. Every splash, every crack of floating debris made them flinch. The night seemed endless. Time stood still. There was only cold, darkness, fear, and the thin beam of a flashlight desperately fighting against the gloom. On that night, there were not doctors, fishermen, or teachers. They were just a handful of people on a rooftop, lost in a ruined world, united by a single, common hope to survive until dawn. When the first pale rays of dawn began to break through the heavy clouds, a horrifying panorama was revealed to the survivors on the roof. The town of Kamioka was gone. In its place was a vast, filthy lake from which the skeletons of buildings protruded like tombstones. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dark sludge. The landscape was monochrome, gray, and dead. But the dawn brought more than just the realization of the tragedy's scale. It brought a new threat. On the outskirts of the town, in the port area, stood an oil depot with several giant fuel tanks. The earthquake had damaged them, causing a leak. Now, as the water began to slowly recede, exposing the twisted metal, all it took was a single spark from a severed power line. First came a dull thud, and then the eastern sky lit up with a brilliant orange flash. A massive fireball shot into the sky, and a few seconds later, the shockwave reached the school roof, forcing everyone to duck. One of the tanks had exploded, but that was only the beginning. The burning fuel, lighter than water, spread across the surface. The fire began to advance rapidly. It was as if the ocean itself, which had swallowed the city during the night, had now caught fire. Giant columns of thick, black smoke rose into the sky, obscuring the morning sun. Orange tongues of flame danced on the water, creeping closer to the ruins in the center of the town. The air filled with the acrid smell of burning. Breathing became difficult. Ash began to fall from the sky like black snow. For the people on the roof, it was a surreal, apocalyptic spectacle. They had survived the earthquake, survived the tsunami, survived the freezing night. Now, they were threatened by fire. Burning debris, carried by the wind, fell into the water around their shelter. One piece, a smoldering wooden beam, landed on the roof just a few meters away from them. The men rushed to stomp it out before it could ignite anything. It became clear the elements were not letting them go. Nature kept changing its face, earth, water, now fire, but its goal remained the same: annihilation. The people on the roof looked at the burning sea and realized that even if the water completely receded, they would have to descend into hell. The city had become a deadly trap of water, fire, and ruins. The hope that had timidly flickered with the first rays of sunlight began to die out again, replaced by a profound despair. They were cut off from the world, and the world, it seemed, had forgotten them, leaving them alone with the planet's rage. By midday, the water began to retreat as quickly as it had come. It left behind a thick layer of foul-smelling silt, mixed with garbage, wreckage, and the bodies of the dead. The town had become a gray, lifeless swamp. The fire at the oil depot still raged, but the wind was blowing the smoke out to sea. For the survivors on the school roof, it was time to act. They could not stay where they were. There was no food or water, and there were injured people among them who needed help. Carefully, helping one another, they descended into the ruined world. The scene that greeted them was worse than anything they could have imagined. The streets were gone. Everything was buried under piles of concrete, twisted metal, overturned cars, and boats that had been carried several kilometers inland. The air was heavy with the stench of mud and smoke. Their first task was to search for other survivors. Splitting into small groups, they began to make their way through the wreckage, calling out, "Is anyone alive?" The only answer was silence. It seemed hopeless, that they were the only ones who had made it through this hell. Despair began to take hold, but then they heard a faint, barely audible sound. It sounded like a child's cry. The sound was coming from beneath the ruins of a small two-story house. Several men began frantically clearing the debris with their bare hands, scraping them raw on the sharp edges of concrete. They tossed aside planks, pieces of walls, and furniture. And there, under the wreckage, in a small, cramped space, they saw him. A little boy, about 4 years old, was sitting under an overturned table. A heavy bookshelf had fallen next to him, but it had landed at an angle, creating a pocket of air that had saved his life. He was terrified and covered in dust, but he was alive and unharmed. When one of the rescuers lifted him into his arms, the boy clung to him tightly and began to cry, this time out loud. This discovery was a miracle. It filled the hearts of the people with incredible hope. If this child could survive, then others might still be alive beneath the ruins. It meant there was something to fight for. Inspired, they continued their search with renewed energy. And the miracles continued. An hour later, they found an elderly woman trapped in the bathroom of her destroyed house. It was the only room that had remained intact. Then they pulled a man with a broken leg, but who was conscious, from under a pile of rubble. Every person found alive was a victory in their war against the elements. Their joy was mixed with tears. They carried the rescued back to the school, which became their temporary camp and hospital. Those who were able-bodied shared their last pieces of clothing and tried to find bottled water. This shared tragedy and shared hope forged complete strangers into one large family. They were no longer alone in their struggle. On the second day, the survivors had established a semblance of life in their camp by the school. They divided tasks. Some continued to clear rubble in search of people. Others scavenged for canned food and bottled water in the ruins of shops. And a third group cared for the injured, using bandages and antiseptics from the school's first aid kit. A fragile but palpable hope emerged that help would come soon, and they just needed to hold on. They learned to navigate the new, mangled landscape of their town. They knew which areas of debris were especially dangerous and which paths were safe. It seemed the worst was truly over, and now they faced a long but straightforward task of survival. But the planet was not done with them yet. In the afternoon, As a group of rescuers tried to move a heavy concrete slab, the earth trembled again. It wasn't as powerful as the first shock, but in the midst of total devastation, it proved to be fatal. The ground shook, and structures that had been barely standing began to collapse completely. The half-ruined wall of a nearby building came crashing down, raising a cloud of dust. The last standing corner of the supermarket folded like a house of cards. The ground vibrated beneath their feet once more. The primal fear that had begun to subside returned with a vengeance. Panic seized the people. The first thought that pierced everyone's mind was, another tsunami. In a frenzy, people started running back toward the hill, toward the school. The instinct for self-preservation drowned out all other feelings. Some who were stronger and faster pushed others aside, trying to save themselves. In that moment, the fragile unity born from shared tragedy began to crack. A young woman stumbled and fell, but the man running behind her simply jumped over her without a second glance. But the old fisherman, Kenji, who saw it, yelled at the top of his lungs, "Stop! Only together. If we abandon each other, we will all die." His cry, filled with desperation and fury, had an effect on some. A few people stopped. They helped the woman to her feet. They saw an injured man who couldn't run and took him by the arms. A group of 20 people, including those they had just rescued, began to retreat to the hill together, supporting the weak and the wounded. Those who ran alone scattered among the ruins. But this group, united in the face of a new threat, survived. They reached a safe spot and waited. No new tsunami came. The aftershock was strong, but it didn't trigger another wave. When everything calmed down, they looked at each other. They were dirty, exhausted, and terrified, but there was something new in their eyes. They had just passed the most difficult test. They understood that their only strength was not in the speed of their legs, but in the hand extended to another. This second strike not only destroyed the remnants of their town, but also forged their will to live, turning a crowd of survivors into a true fellowship. By the third day, despair was beginning to turn into apathy. The scavenged food and water were running out. The condition of the injured was worsening. People sat near the school, silently gazing at the ruins. Every minute, they listened, hoping to catch a sound in the sky that was different from the howl of the wind. But all they heard was silence. And then, just as hope had nearly run out, they heard it. At first, it was a barely perceptible, low hum. Someone looked up. "Do you hear that?" Everyone froze, listening intently. The hum grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the rumble of the earth. It was the roar of engines. A minute later, a dark that appeared on the horizon from inland. It grew rapidly, taking the shape of a helicopter. It was help. Rescuers had finally reached their isolated, wiped-out district. People began to shout, to wave their arms, to cry. These were tears of relief, tears of joy, tears from the realization that they had not been abandoned, that the nightmare was coming to an end. The helicopter circled the ruins several times, assessing the situation, then hovered over the only large, flat area available, the schoolyard. A rope ladder and a rescue basket were lowered. The evacuation began. The first to be lifted were the severely injured and the children. Rescuers on board wrapped them in warm blankets and gave them water. Every person, once inside the helicopter, looked down at the ruined city, saying goodbye to their past. The evacuation took several hours. Helicopters came and went, taking a few people at a time. As the last group was boarding a rescue boat that had approached from the sea, the old fisherman Kenji turned back for one last look at what had been his home. He saw the ruins of the port where his boat used to be. He saw the place where his house, where he was born and raised, once stood. He saw the ravaged land and the gray sky. Next to him, a young man who had lost his entire family was crying softly. Kenji put a hand on his shoulder and spoke the words that became the symbol of their resilience. "We've lost everything. Our homes, our boats, our past. But as long as we are alive, this is not the end. This is just the beginning." The earthquake and tsunami wiped the town of Kamioka off the map. It now exists only on old charts and in the memories of those who survived. Thousands of people died on that terrible night, victims of nature's fury, which could neither be predicted nor stopped. But hundreds managed to survive. They survived because one old man shouted to the hills at the right moment. They survived because they shared the warmth and light of a single tiny flashlight on a cold rooftop. They endured the night, the fire on the water, and the aftershocks that should have broken them completely. They searched for strangers under the rubble, risking their own lives. They learned that the only way to be saved was to save each other. This is not just a story of destruction. It is a story of the incredible strength of the human spirit. It is about how, even when the ground gives way and the ocean overflows its banks, a person is capable of fighting. Fighting for themselves, for their neighbor, for the child under the wreckage. It is this struggle, this unity in the face of chaos, that proves, even in the most terrible catastrophe, when it seems all is lost, as long as one person is alive and willing to extend a hand to another, it is not the end. You have been listening to the story of how the earth opened up over Japan. But stories like this happen all over the world, reminding us of how fragile our world is and how strong we can be together. Subscribe to the channel. There are more stories ahead that are impossible to turn away from.